What does it feel like to be erased by the man who once promised you forever? Emily Carter stood at the edge of a ballroom that shimmered like a polished illusion, all crystal chandeliers and soft laughter that didn't belong to her anymore. And for a moment, she wondered if anyone in that room could still see her, or if she had already become a ghost in a life she used to live. 7 years. That was how long she had been Mrs. Ryan Blake. Long enough to memorize the rhythm of his ambition, the quiet calculation behind his smiles, the way he could make a room bend around him without ever raising his voice. And now all of it had been reduced to a signature on a piece of paper and a polite invitation she should have never accepted. She should have stayed in her small apartment on the Upper West Side, where the walls carried the faint scent of chamomile tea and unfinished thoughts, where the silence felt honest, not like this curated noise that pressed against her skin like something artificial, something suffocating. But she came anyway, maybe to prove she was not broken, maybe to see if he was. Across the room, Ryan Blake stood exactly where he belonged, at the center of everything, his tailored tuxedo sharp enough to cut, his hand resting possessively at the waist of his new bride, a woman sculpted for attention, all angles and practiced laughter, the kind of woman Emily had once been told she could never become. He looked happy. No, not happy. Certain. Like a man who had successfully rewritten his own history and believed it completely. Emily felt it then, that familiar hollow ache, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet pressure beneath her ribs, the kind that did not ask for attention but refused to disappear. Invisible. That was the word. She had spent months becoming it, shrinking her world down to manageable pieces, learning how to exist without taking up space, and yet standing here, under the same lights that once belonged to her. The illusion cracked just enough to let the truth through. She had not been replaced. She had been erased. A ripple of laughter broke through her thoughts, and she realized too late that it was directed at her. Ryan's voice carried easily, smooth, controlled, the same voice that used to say her name like it meant something. Emily, he said, almost amused, as if she were a detail he had forgotten to remove. I didn't expect you to come. I thought you would have moved on. The pause was deliberate. The room leaned in. She felt every eye on her, measuring, comparing, deciding. I did, she said quietly, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. But he smiled, that same practiced smile that had once convinced investors, friends, and her, that he was always right. I am glad, he continued, glancing at his bride as if to confirm the upgrade. Because some people are just not built for this kind of life. The words landed softly. That was the cruelty of it. No shouting, no anger, just precision. A clean cut, the kind that did not bleed until later. Around them, the laughter returned, softer this time, but sharper, like glass underfoot. Emily felt the room shift, closing in, reducing her to something smaller than she had ever allowed herself to be. And for a second, just 1 second, she considered leaving, disappearing the way he expected her to, fading back into a life that required nothing from anyone. Her fingers curled slightly at her side, then stilled, as if remembering something her mind had not yet said out loud. Why should she be the one to disappear? The question did not arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. Quiet. Unshakable. She lifted her chin just enough to breathe again, not to fight, not to argue, but to exist in a space that had already decided she did not belong. And somewhere between the music and the murmurs, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air before a storm, like the moment before a story changes direction. And then, without warning, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The doors did not simply open. They shifted the entire room. Conversations fractured mid-sentence. Laughter dissolved into a low, uncertain murmur, and for a brief, suspended second, it felt as if the air itself had been pulled tighter, sharper, charged with something no one could quite name. Emily did not turn immediately. She felt it first, the change in attention, the subtle redirection of every gaze away from her and towards something else, something stronger, something that demanded to be seen without asking. Then she heard the whispers, quiet at first, then spreading. A name, repeated just low enough to feel important. She turned and saw him. He did not rush. He did not scan the room. He walked forward with the kind of stillness that made everything around him feel temporary, like background noise to a reality only he controlled. His suit was dark, perfectly tailored, but it was not the fabric that drew attention. It was the way he wore it. Like power was not something he performed, but something he carried effortlessly, like a second skin. The kind of man who did not need to prove anything, because everything around him already knew. Emily's breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition of something deeper, something she had felt before without understanding it. Control. Absolute. Unquestioned. Around her, the room was no longer watching her. They were watching him. Ryan noticed it too. Of course he did. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his grip tightening at his bride's waist as his eyes tracked the man's approach, calculating, assessing, searching for context that was suddenly slipping out of his grasp. "Who is that?" his bride whispered, her voice no longer perfectly composed, her confidence thinning at the edges. Ryan did not answer, because he already knew. Or at least, he understood enough to feel the threat before he could name it. The man kept walking. Not toward the stage. Not toward the bar. Toward her. Emily felt it then. The full weight of the moment pressing in, the quiet before impact, the invisible line being drawn across a room that had just decided she was nothing. Her pulse slowed instead of racing. Strange. Like her body had been waiting for this before her mind could catch up. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the noise of the room faded into something distant, irrelevant. For a second, neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something shifted again, deeper this time, as if the story everyone thought they understood had just been rewritten without warning. Ryan stepped forward, unable to stop himself, his voice cutting in with forced control. "Can I help you?" It was a mistake. A small one. But in a room like this, small mistakes echoed. The man did not look at him. Not immediately. His attention remained on Emily, steady, assessing, as if confirming something only he could. "See." Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. The gesture was simple, precise, but it landed like a fracture through the entire room. Emily felt the warmth of his touch, the calm certainty behind it, and for the first time that night, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen. Fully. Completely. "I was looking for you," he said quietly. No hesitation. No performance. Just truth delivered with quiet authority. A ripple moved through the crowd. Sharper now. Louder. The whispers no longer contained. Names were being said again. Louder this time. Recognition spreading like a current. Ryan's expression shifted, confidence cracking just enough to reveal something underneath. Doubt. Real, undeniable doubt. "I think there's been some confusion," Ryan said, stepping closer, trying to reclaim control of a moment that was no longer his. "Emily and I." "You are mistaken," the man replied, finally turning his gaze toward him, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop with it. It was not anger. It was not even confrontation. It was certainty, the kind that did not invite argument. Ryan stopped speaking, not because he chose to, because something in that look made continuing impossible. Emily's fingers tightened slightly in his hand, not out of fear, but grounding, like she was anchoring herself to something real in a room built on illusions. The whispers grew louder. The name was clear now, recognizable, powerful, and suddenly, the balance of the room had shifted completely. Emily was no longer the woman being watched out of pity. She was the center of something no one understood yet. And the only question left, hanging in the charged silence, was not who he was, but who she had been all along. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, slowly, unevenly, like glass under pressure, until the whispers turned into something sharper, more dangerous, a collective realization moving through the crowd that whatever they thought this moment was, it was no longer under their control. Emily could feel it in the way eyes no longer dismissed her, but studied her, recalculated her, as if trying to rewrite her place in a story they had already decided. The man's hand remained steady around hers, not tight, not possessive, just certain, and that certainty traveled through her, grounding her in a way she had not felt in months. Ryan forced a laugh, the sound thin, brittle, like something rehearsed too many times. "All right," he said, glancing around as if the room would support him. "This is unexpected, but I think we are all a little confused here." He stepped closer, his confidence stitched together with effort now, his gaze flicking between Emily and the man beside her, searching for cracks, for weakness, for anything he could still control. "Emily," He continued, softer this time, as if trying a different angle. You don't have to do this. The words landed differently than he intended. Not protective, not kind, but exposed, as if he still believed she needed permission to exist. Emily felt it then, the last fragile thread of who she used to be, the version of herself that would have stepped back, apologized, disappeared to make things easier for everyone else. It loosened, then broke. She did not pull her hand away. She did not lower her gaze. She simply stood there, steady, present, no longer shrinking to fit a space that had already rejected her. Around them, the energy shifted again, heavier now, charged with expectation, as more guests began to recognize the man standing beside her, their whispers no longer subtle. Names were confirmed. Reputations recalled. The kind of recognition that did not ask questions, only demanded respect. Ryan heard it. Of course he did. His expression tightened, something sharper replacing the doubt now. Not fear. Not yet. But the first crack in certainty. I asked you a question, Ryan said, his voice firmer, pushing back, trying to reclaim authority that was slipping through his fingers. Who exactly are you? This time, the man did not ignore him. He turned fully, his posture unchanged, his presence filling the space without effort. And for the first time that night, Ryan Blake looked like a man who had miscalculated. Someone you should have paid more attention to, he replied calmly. No raised voice. No theatrics. Just truth delivered with precision. A ripple moved through the crowd, stronger now, undeniable. Emily felt it too, not as pressure, but as clarity, as if the entire room had shifted into focus around her. Ryan's bride stepped back slightly, her earlier confidence dissolving into something quieter, more uncertain, her eyes moving between them as if trying to understand how the balance had flipped so completely in a matter of seconds. This is ridiculous, she muttered under her breath, but no one was listening to her anymore. No one was looking at her. The spotlight had moved. Entirely. Ryan exhaled slowly, forcing control back into his expression, but it no longer sat naturally on him. It looked constructed. Fragile. Emily, he said again. This time her name sounding less like ownership and more like a question he did not know how to answer. What is this? And that was it. The moment shifted. Not because of the man beside her, but because of her. Emily Carter, the woman who had been erased, who had been reduced to a footnote in someone else's success story, felt something rise within her. Not anger, not revenge, but something steadier. Ownership. Of herself. Of this moment. Of the truth he had never bothered to see. She turned slightly, just enough to face Ryan fully, her expression calm, composed, but no longer soft. You already decided who I was, she said quietly. You just never asked who I became. The words settled into the room like something irreversible. No one laughed this time. No one looked away. And for the first time since she walked into that ballroom, Emily was not the past he had discarded. She was the unknown standing in front of him. And that was far more dangerous. The man beside her shifted his grip slightly, his thumb brushing once against her hand. A small, grounding gesture that carried more meaning than anything spoken aloud. And then, as the tension in the room reached something close to breaking, he stepped half a pace forward, his voice cutting cleanly through the silence. There is no confusion, he said. And every eye locked onto him again. Emily Carter is my wife. The words did not echo. They settled. Heavy. Final. Irreversible. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. As if the entire ballroom had forgotten how to breathe. Emily felt it first in the stillness, the way the air seemed to press in around them, waiting, watching, demanding confirmation of something that had already been said too clearly to be taken back. My wife. The phrase lingered, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. Ryan blinked once, slow, disbelieving, as if his mind refused to process what his ears had just heard. That's not possible, he said. But even as the words left him, they lacked conviction, like a script that no longer fit the scene. His gaze snapped to Emily, searching her face for denial, for hesitation, for any sign that this was some kind of performance, some desperate attempt to reclaim dignity. But she did not flinch. She did not correct it. She did not step away. She stood there, calm, steady, her hand still in his. And in that silence, Ryan understood something he had not prepared for. He did not know her anymore. Around them, The whispers had transformed into something sharper, more electric, the kind of murmured recognition that spread through powerful rooms when something significant, something rare, was unfolding in real time. Names were no longer questioned. They were confirmed. "That's Daniel Whitaker," someone said under their breath, not quiet enough. The name moved through the crowd like a current, pulling reactions with it, subtle shifts in posture, in tone, in attention, as people recalibrated not just the man, but the woman standing beside him. Emily felt it without looking, the shift from dismissal to calculation, from pity to something closer to respect, or maybe fear of having misjudged her so completely. Ryan heard it too. Of course he did. And this time, the crack in his composure deepened. Not enough for anyone else to call it out, but enough for her to see. "Whitaker," he repeated, the name sounding unfamiliar in his mouth, like something he had heard before but never bothered to remember. His mind raced, connecting fragments, headlines, deals, the kind of information that only mattered when it affected him directly, and suddenly, it did. "You're him?" It was not a question of identity. It was a realization of scale. Daniel did not react to the recognition. He did not nod, did not confirm. He simply stood there, his presence unchanged, as if the room catching up to him was inevitable, not impressive. "Yes," someone else answered for him from the crowd, unable to contain the moment. "Whitaker Group, the acquisition last quarter, the tech merger," the details blurred together, but the meaning was clear. Power. Not the kind Ryan performed. The kind that reshaped things. Emily felt Daniel's thumb brush lightly against her hand again, a subtle anchor, a reminder that this moment, overwhelming as it seemed, was real, and more importantly, it was hers too. Ryan exhaled slowly, trying to regain footing, but the ground had already shifted beneath him. "So what? Is this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more controlled, but no longer dominant. "A joke?" The word hung awkwardly, misplaced, like it did not belong in the same space as everything else unfolding. Emily almost smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition. He still thought this was about him. "No," Daniel answered before she could speak, his tone calm, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "It is not." Another pause. Short, precise. Then, softer, but somehow heavier. "It is simply the truth you chose not to see." The words did not attack. They revealed. And that made them far more dangerous. Ryan's bride shifted again, her discomfort now visible, her earlier confidence completely unraveled as she glanced between the guests, sensing the change in energy, the way attention had moved away from her entirely, leaving her standing in a moment that no longer belonged to her. "Ryan," she whispered, lower now, uncertain, "what's going on?" But he did not answer, because he did not know. For the first time in a long time, Ryan Blake did not have control over the narrative, and the realization settled into his expression like something cold, something unwelcome. Emily watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet clarity that felt sharper than either. This was not revenge. Not exactly. It was reclamation. Of herself. Of the space he had taken. Of the version of her he had erased without permission. And as the room continued to shift around them, as the whispers grew louder, as the weight of the moment pressed in from every side, one truth became impossible to ignore. The story he thought he had ended had never actually been finished, and he was no longer the one writing it. The room did not return to normal. It reorganized itself around a new center, and that center was no longer Ryan Blake. Emily could feel it in the subtle shifts, in the way conversations no longer flowed freely but paused, redirected, recalculated around her, as if everyone present was quietly rewriting their understanding of who she was and, more importantly, who she had become. The weight of Daniel's words still lingered, not loud, not repeated, but impossible to ignore. "My wife." It was not just a claim. It was a declaration of position, of power, of reality. And in a room built on appearances, reality was the most disruptive force of all. Ryan straightened his posture, instinctively reaching for control the only way he knew how, through composure, through image, through the illusion that nothing had truly changed. But something had, irreversibly. "If this is some kind of game," he said, his voice measured but edged with something sharper now, something closer to frustration, "I suggest you end it here." The words were directed at Daniel. but his eyes kept returning to Emily, searching, demanding, as if she owed him an explanation for a life he had already dismissed. Emily met his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for the first time, there was no trace of the woman he remembered trying to accommodate him, trying to soften herself around his expectations. That version of her was gone. Not replaced. Reclaimed. "It is not a game," she said quietly. No raised voice. No emotion displayed. Just certainty. The kind he used to own. The kind he had never expected from her. A flicker of something crossed Ryan's face, brief but undeniable. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief colliding with reality. Then when exactly did this happen? He pressed, his tone tightening, the question heavier than it seemed. Because it was not just about timing. It was about everything he had missed. Everything he had chosen not to see. Emily did not answer immediately. She did not rush to fill the silence the way she used to. Did not offer explanations to make him comfortable. Instead, she let the question sit. Let it exist without rescue. And in that pause, the power dynamic shifted again, subtly but completely. "It started the moment I stopped being invisible," she said finally. The words landed differently than anything else that night. Not sharp, not confrontational, but undeniable. Around them, the room reacted again, softer this time, but deeper, as if people were no longer just watching a spectacle, but witnessing a transformation they could not fully understand. Ryan shook his head once, a small, controlled motion, but the edges of his composure were beginning to fray. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, a faint laugh slipping through, though it carried no real amusement. "That you just became this?" His gesture was vague, but loaded, encompassing not just Daniel, but the shift in how everyone now looked at her. Emily almost answered, almost explained, but then she realized something that felt both simple and profound. She did not need him to believe anything. Daniel stepped slightly closer beside her, not interrupting, not taking over, but reinforcing a presence that was already undeniable. "Belief is not required," he said calmly. "Only recognition." Another silence followed, heavier this time, because the truth had already settled in. Ryan's bride glanced around again, her discomfort now unmistakable, her place in the room quietly dissolving as attention continued to orbit elsewhere. She adjusted her posture, her expression, but it no longer had the same effect. The spotlight had moved, and it was not coming back. Ryan noticed that too, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. His world had always been predictable, controlled, structured around his decisions, his narrative, his version of events. And now, standing in the middle of what was supposed to be his perfect moment, that structure was unraveling in real time. "Emily," he said again, her name sounding unfamiliar now, like something he was trying to reclaim but no longer owned. "You are standing here acting like this is normal." He hesitated, searching for the right word, but none fit. Because nothing about this was normal. For him. For her, it felt like something else entirely. Resolution. "It is not normal," she replied softly. "It is overdue." The sentence was quiet, almost gentle, but it cut deeper than anything else she had said. Because it was not about him anymore. It never had been. A murmur moved through the crowd again, not loud, but unanimous, the kind of reaction that did not need volume to carry weight. Emily felt it settle around her, not as pressure, but as confirmation. She was no longer standing in the shadow of who she used to be. She was standing in the truth of who she had become. And for the first time since she walked into that room, she understood something clearly. This moment was not the end of something. It was the beginning of everything he never saw coming. And judging by the way Ryan stood there now, silent, uncertain, watching a reality he could no longer control unfold in front of him, he was only just beginning to realize it too. The music resumed, but it no longer belonged to the room. It felt like background noise to something far more precise unfolding in silence, in glances, in the subtle recalibration of power that no one could ignore anymore. Emily stood exactly where she had been, but everything about her position had changed, as if the invisible lines that once kept her small had been erased and redrawn in her favor. Daniel's presence beside her remained steady, unshaken, but it was no longer the only force holding the room's attention. She was, and that realization settled into her with a quiet, unfamiliar strength. Ryan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he scanned the faces around him, searching for support, for alignment, for the unspoken agreement that this was still his stage, his moment. But the room was no longer responding to him the same way. The nods were slower, the smiles more cautious, the attention divided. For a man who built his life on perception, it was a fracture he could not easily repair. "All right," he said finally, his tone shifting again, softer, controlled, as if recalculating a different approach. "If this is real, then you owe me an explanation." The word "oh" lingered in the air, familiar, almost instinctive, as if some part of him still believed she existed within the boundaries he had defined for her. Emily noticed it immediately, not the demand itself, but the assumption behind it, and something in her stilled completely. "I do not owe you anything," she replied, her voice calm, level, without edge, which somehow made it land harder. The simplicity of it cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, drawn closer to a moment that was no longer polite, no longer contained. Ryan's expression flickered, just briefly, but enough. He had not expected resistance. Not from her. Not like this. "That is not how this works," he said, though his certainty was thinning now, his words sounding more like an argument he was trying to convince himself of rather than her. Emily held his gaze, steady, unyielding, and for the first time, he was the one adjusting, the one searching for footing that no longer existed beneath him. "That is exactly how this works," she said. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again, deeper now, as if the room itself was recognizing a truth that had been delayed for too long. Daniel remained silent, but his presence reinforced everything she said, not by speaking, but by standing exactly where he was. Beside her, not in front, not above. With her. That difference did not go unnoticed. Ryan's bride stepped back another inch, her composure fully fractured now, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to uncertainty, as she realized the narrative she had stepped into was no longer centered around her. The spotlight had moved completely, and there was no reclaiming it. Ryan turned slightly toward Daniel, as if searching for a more familiar opponent, someone he could measure, negotiate, challenge. "And you," he said, his tone sharpening again, reaching for control through confrontation. "You expect me to just accept this? That she is suddenly your wife?" The pause carried disbelief, but also something else now. Unease. Daniel met his gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, his calm unbroken, and in that stillness, the contrast between them became impossible to ignore. "I do not require your acceptance," he said evenly. "Only your understanding." The words landed with quiet finality, leaving no room for argument, no space for negotiation. Ryan's composure faltered again, more visibly this time, as the reality of the situation pressed in from every side. This was not a misunderstanding he could correct, not a narrative he could spin. It was something else entirely, something outside his control. Emily felt it then, the last remnants of the old dynamic dissolving completely, the invisible structure that had once defined her place in his world collapsing into nothing. She was no longer reacting to him. She was no longer positioned beneath him. She was simply standing, equal, unmoved. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. A low murmur spread through the crowd again, quieter now, but deeper, the kind of reaction that signaled a collective shift rather than a momentary spectacle. People were no longer just watching. They were adjusting, reassessing, aligning themselves with what they now understood to be the new center of power in the room. Ryan noticed. Of course he did. And this time, there was no mistaking the change in his expression. The confidence was still there, but it was no longer absolute. It was conditional, fragile, dependent on something he no longer fully controlled. "This is not over," he said finally, his voice lower now, more contained, but edged with something sharper, something unresolved. It was not a threat. Not quite. More like a realization spoken out loud. Emily did not respond immediately. She let the words sit, let them exist without reaction, without escalation, and in that silence, she understood something with complete clarity. He still thought this was a confrontation, a conflict, something that required a winner and a loser. But for her, it was neither. It was a shift, a reclamation, A transformation that had already happened long before she walked into this room. It already is, she said softly. And as the words settled, as the tension in the room tightened once more, not with uncertainty this time, but with anticipation, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This moment was not the peak. It was the turning point. And whatever came next was going to change everything. The word turning point lingered in the air, but the room had not yet caught up to what it meant. People were still watching, still waiting, as if instinctively sensing that something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface, something not yet fully revealed. Emily felt it too, not as pressure, but as a quiet expansion, like space opening where there had once been none. For years, she had learned to compress herself into smaller versions, softer reactions, quieter responses, until even her own presence felt negotiable. But standing here now, with every eye recalibrating around her, that version of herself felt distant, irrelevant, gone. Ryan, however, was not finished. He could not be. Not like this. Not in front of a room that had always affirmed his version of reality. You think this changes anything? He said, his voice steadier now, but only because it was controlled, forced into place with precision. He took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to reassert himself into the moment, to remind the room, and maybe himself, that he was still part of the equation. You walk in here with him, he continued, nodding briefly toward Daniel, and suddenly rewrite everything? His eyes locked onto hers, searching, demanding, almost pleading beneath the surface of his composure. That is not how history works. Emily listened, not with defensiveness, not with urgency, but with a calm clarity that felt sharper than anything she could have said before. History. The word echoed differently now, because he was right about one thing. It did not change the past, but it did change what the past meant. No, she said quietly, her voice steady, grounded. It is not. Hey. Pause. Then, softer, but heavier. But it does change what you thought it made me. The distinction landed cleanly. Precise. Around them, the room reacted again, not loudly, but in that subtle, collective shift that marked understanding. Ryan's expression tightened, the line between control and frustration thinning further as the conversation slipped beyond the framework he was used to navigating. You are still the same person, he said, more firmly now, as if stating a fact could make it true. Nothing about you just becomes different overnight. Emily almost smiled, not because he was wrong, but because he still could not see the difference between who she had been with him and who she had always been underneath. You are right, she said, her tone even, unshaken. Nothing changes overnight. Another pause. Deliberate. It just becomes visible when someone finally stops looking away. The words settled deeper than anything before, not because they were louder, but because they carried something he could not easily dismiss. Truth without explanation. Ryan's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. The certainty he had relied on for so long now fractured into something less stable, less predictable. For a moment, he said nothing, and that silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, not stepping forward, not taking over, but reinforcing the space she now held, his presence a constant reminder that this moment was not fragile, not temporary. It was anchored, real. Ryan's bride glanced between them again, her discomfort now unmistakable, her earlier confidence completely unraveled as she realized the narrative she had aligned herself with was no longer dominant. The room had chosen a new center, and she was no longer part of it. Ryan, she whispered again, quieter this time, uncertain, but he did not respond. He could not. Not while everything he believed about control, about power, about identity, was being quietly dismantled in front of him. Emily watched him, not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, but with something far more final. Understanding. This was the man who had once defined her world, who had shaped her sense of self by what he chose to see and what he chose to ignore. And now, standing in front of him, she realized something that felt both simple and irreversible. He had never actually seen her. You did not lose me, she said softly. The words were. Not an attack. Not an accusation. Just clarity. You just never knew who I was. The sentence landed with a weight that did not need volume to carry impact. Around them, the room stilled again, drawn into a silence that felt deeper, more intentional, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something that could not be undone. Ryan's composure faltered completely for a fraction of a second, a crack wide enough to reveal what had been building underneath all along. Not anger, not arrogance, but something far more unsettling. Regret. He masked it quickly, of course. He always did. But it was there, and Emily saw it. For the first time, the balance between them was not just shifted. It was irreversible. And as that realization settled into the space between them, quiet but absolute, one question remained, hanging just beneath the surface of everything that had been said. If this was who she had become, then what else had he been blind to all along? The question did not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. It lingered in the air between them, quiet but relentless, pressing against the edges of everything Ryan thought he understood. If he had been wrong about her, then what else had he misjudged? The thought unsettled him more than he allowed anyone to see. Emily could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable, like the ground beneath a structure beginning to give way, not in a dramatic collapse, but in quiet, irreversible fractures. For years, he had been certain. About her. About himself. About the roles they played in a life he curated with precision. And now, standing in the same room where he expected to celebrate his future, he was being confronted by something he had never accounted for. Her transformation. Not sudden, not artificial, but inevitable. So this is what you wanted? He asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge, replaced with something more searching, more uncertain. To prove something? The question hung between them, but it was already flawed, because it assumed intention where there had been none. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that would have once been mistaken for softness. It was not softness. It was distance. No, she said. This is what happened when I stopped trying to prove anything. The distinction landed with quiet force. Around them, the room remained still, attentive, as if collectively aware that whatever was unfolding now was no longer about spectacle, but about truth revealing itself in layers. Ryan absorbed her words slowly, his mind moving through them, searching for an angle, a response, a way to regain control of a conversation that no longer followed his logic. And him? He asked, glancing briefly at Daniel, though not with the same confidence as before. What is he, then? Part of that transformation. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, like something he did not fully understand but could not ignore. Emily felt Daniel's presence beside her, steady, grounded, but he did not speak. He did not need to. This part of the story was hers. No, she said again, her voice even. He is not part of it. A brief pause. Then, quieter, but more revealing, he is what happened after. The sentence shifted the room again, not loudly, but deeply, as if everyone present understood the implication beneath it. This was not a rescue, not a replacement, not a reaction. It was a continuation, a consequence of something Ryan had never bothered to see. His expression tightened, the pieces rearranging in his mind, but no matter how he tried to position them, they refused to align the way he needed them to. You expect me to believe that you just moved on like this? He pressed, though the question carried less conviction now, more confusion than challenge. Emily considered him for a moment, not dismissively, not harshly, but with a clarity that felt almost detached. I did not move on, she said. I moved forward. The words were simple, but they carried weight, because forward implied direction, growth, change that did not require permission. Around them, the energy shifted again, quieter now, more settled, as if the room was no longer waiting for a dramatic reveal, but absorbing something more lasting, more significant. Ryan's bride stood slightly behind him now, no longer trying to reclaim attention, her presence fading into the background as the focus remained fixed on a dynamic she could neither control nor fully understand. Ryan noticed, but he did not turn toward her. He could not. Not when everything that mattered in this moment was happening in front of him. You always needed me, he said suddenly, the words slipping out before he could recalibrate them, rawer than anything he had said so far. It was not an insult. Not exactly. It was a belief. One he had carried for so long that it felt like fact. Emily did not react immediately. She let the statement exist, let it reveal itself fully, and in that pause, something settled into place with complete clarity. That is what you needed to believe, she said softly. The correction was gentle, but absolute. It did not attack him. It redefined him. Around them, a quiet murmur moved through the crowd again, not sharp, not reactive, but acknowledging, as if everyone present understood that something fundamental had just shifted. Ryan's certainty, the foundation of everything he had built his identity on, was no longer intact. And he could feel it. "Then why are you here?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of pretense, revealing something more honest beneath the surface. Not anger, not control, but confusion. Real, unguarded confusion. The question lingered longer than the others, because it mattered. Not to the room, not to the crowd, but to him. Emily met his gaze, steady, unwavering, and for the first time since the conversation began, there was a hint of something else in her expression. Not softness, not nostalgia, but closure. "Because you needed to see it," she said. A pause. Then, softer, but final, "even if you do not understand it." The words settled between them, quiet but definitive, like the closing of something that had remained open for far too long. And in that moment, as the weight of everything unsaid finally found its place, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about ending something. Completely. And judging by the way Ryan stood there now, silent, searching, watching a version of her he could no longer define, he was only just beginning to understand what that meant. The word ending settled into the room like a quiet verdict, but it did not bring relief. It brought weight. The kind that pressed into every unspoken memory, every moment that had once defined them, now re-examined under a different light. Ryan stood there, unmoving, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make certainty impossible. For the first time in a long time, he did not have a response ready, and the room felt it. The absence of his voice, once so constant, so controlled, now left a space that no one rushed to fill. Emily did not move either. She did not step forward, did not step back. She simply remained, grounded in a moment that no longer required her to prove anything. But something inside her shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, because closure was not as simple as words. It was not a single moment. It was layers, and not all of them had been revealed yet. Ryan exhaled slowly, his composure no longer breaking, but reshaping, adapting into something more restrained, more cautious. "You said I needed to see this," he began, his voice lower, steadier, but stripped of its earlier authority. "So what exactly am I supposed to be seeing?" The question was not defensive. Not entirely. It carried something else now. A need to understand. Even if he did not like the answer. Emily studied him for a moment, her gaze no longer carrying the weight of past hurt, but something more precise. Measured. Intentional. "The difference," she said simply. He frowned slightly, the word too vague, too open. "Between what?" he pressed. And this time, she did not hesitate. "Between the woman you thought you had, and the woman you never took the time to know." The words settled into the silence with a quiet finality, not sharp, not raised, but undeniable. Around them, the room remained still, the kind of stillness that only exists when something real is unfolding, something that cannot be reduced to spectacle. Ryan absorbed it slowly, the meaning moving through him in pieces, each one more difficult to ignore than the last. "And what?" he said after a pause, his voice tightening just slightly. "I was supposed to just see that? Understand it." There was no accusation in the question, just frustration. Because for a man who had built his life on control, on clarity, on defined outcomes, this kind of ambiguity was unfamiliar. Uncomfortable. Emily's expression softened, but not in the way it once would have. Not to comfort him, but to acknowledge something that no longer required conflict. "No," she said quietly. "You were never going to see it." The honesty in that sentence landed heavier than anything before, because it did not blame him. It defined him. And in doing so, it removed any illusion that things could have been different. Ryan looked at her then. Really looked, as if trying to find something familiar, something that still connected this version of her to the one he remembered. But the connection was gone. Not broken, not damaged, just no longer relevant. "Then why does it matter?" he asked, the question softer now, almost to himself, but spoken aloud. And that was when something shifted again. Not in the room, not in the crowd, but in her. Emily felt it clearly, the final layer of something she had carried for longer than she realized, something that had never been about him, but had always been tied to him. The need to be seen, to be understood, to be acknowledged by the one person who had once defined her world. And now, standing here, she understood something with complete certainty. She did not need that anymore. It does not, she said. The answer was simple, but absolute. Ryan's gaze faltered, just for a second, as if the ground beneath him had shifted again, this time in a way he could not recover from. Because this was not rejection, not anger, not even distance. It was absence. The complete removal of his significance in a part of her life he once controlled. Around them, the room seemed to exhale, the tension shifting into something quieter, more settled, as if everyone present understood that the confrontation they had been witnessing was no longer active. It had resolved, not with a victory, but with an ending. Daniel's hand remained steady in hers, his presence unchanged, but his silence now carried a different weight. Not just support, but confirmation. This was no longer a moment that required defense. It was already decided. Ryan stood there, the man who had once dictated the terms of everything, now left with nothing to negotiate, nothing to reclaim, nothing to redefine. And in that stillness, one truth became impossible to ignore. He had not lost her in this moment. He had lost her long before this. He just had not realized it until now. Emily turned slightly then, not away from him in anger, but away from the version of herself that had once remained tied to him. And as she did, the room shifted one final time, not in shock, not in reaction, but in quiet acknowledgement. The story everyone thought they were watching had already ended. They were just witnessing the final scene. But, as she took a step forward, guided not by the past, but by something far more certain, one question lingered beneath the surface of everything that had unfolded. If this was the ending, then what would her life look like without him in it at all? The question lingered behind her like a shadow that no longer belonged to her. If this was the ending, then what came next? Emily did not rush to answer it. She did not need to. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like something she had to calculate around someone else's expectations. It felt open, unwritten, and that alone was enough. The room, however, had not fully released her yet. Eyes still followed her movement, not with judgment now, but with something quieter, more complex. Recognition, curiosity, respect that arrived too late to matter, but still arrived. She could feel it in the way conversations hesitated as she passed, in the way people subtly adjusted their posture, their tone, their attention. The invisible had become undeniable. Daniel moved with her, not leading, not guiding, but aligned, his presence steady, unobtrusive, yet impossible to ignore. Together, they shifted the room simply by existing within it, and that contrast, between what she had been and what she now represented, hung in the air like something unfinished, something still unfolding. Behind them, Ryan remained where she had left him. For a moment, he did not move. Could not. The weight of everything that had just happened had not settled yet, had not found a place to land within him. He watched her walk away, and something unfamiliar pressed against his chest. Not anger, not pride, something heavier. The realization that he was no longer part of her direction. Emily. Her name followed her, quieter this time, not a command, not a claim, but something closer to a question. She stopped. Not immediately, but enough. The pause was deliberate, controlled. She turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, but not enough to return. That difference mattered. Ryan took a step forward, then another, closing a distance that no longer meant what it used to. The room watched again, drawn back into the gravity of a moment that refused to fully release them. I was wrong, he said. The words were simple, but they carried something he had never offered her before. Admission without justification. The room stilled again, not because of the apology itself, but because of who it came from. Ryan Blake did not admit mistakes. Not publicly. Not like this. Emily looked at him, really looked, and for a brief second, she saw it. Not the man who had erased her. Not the man who had stood at the center of everything. But someone else. Someone uncertain. Someone finally aware of what he had lost. I know, she said softly. No anger. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. And somehow, that landed harder than anything else she could have said. Ryan's expression shifted, the edges of his composure softening, but not in relief. In realization. Because her response did not reopen anything. It closed it further. If I had, he began, but the words faltered before they could take shape, because even he could hear how they sounded. Hypothetical. Too late. Emily shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, but stopping the path he was about to take. You would not have, she said gently. The truth did not accuse. It clarified, and in doing so, it removed any illusion that the past could have been rewritten. Ryan exhaled, the breath heavier now, as if something inside him had finally given way. Around them, the room seemed to recede, the crowd no longer the focus, no longer relevant to what was happening in the space between them. Are you happy? He asked, the question quieter than anything he had said before, stripped of ego, stripped of control, leaving only something honest beneath it. Emily paused, not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer mattered. Not to him, to her. She felt it then, not as a surge, not as something dramatic, but as something steady, grounded, real. The absence of tension, the absence of needing to prove, to fight, to be seen. Peace. Yes, she said. One word. Enough. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing it, the finality of it settling into him in a way nothing else had. Because happiness was not something he could challenge, not something he could negotiate. It simply existed, and it no longer included him. Emily held his gaze for one last moment, not lingering, not searching, just confirming something that no longer needed to be said out loud. Then she turned, fully this time. No hesitation, no pause, and as she walked forward, away from the version of her life that had once defined her, the room shifted one final time, not in shock, not in reaction, but in quiet understanding. This was not an exit. It was a beginning. But beginnings, she realized, were rarely loud. They were quiet, certain, and irreversible. And somewhere behind her, in a room that had once made her feel invisible, a man stood still, watching a life move forward without him, finally understanding that some things, once lost, did not come back. And as Emily stepped into a future that no longer required permission, one question remained, not for him, not for the room, but for her. What would she build now, with everything she had reclaimed? The question of what she would build next had barely settled in her mind when the room shifted again, sharper this time, as if something larger than personal closure was about to surface. Emily slowed her steps, not stopping, but aware now that the story was not finished revealing itself. Daniel's hand remained steady at hers, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a quiet alertness, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Behind them, a voice cut through the low hum of the crowd, louder now, more formal. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? The event host stood near the stage, his tone polished but edged with urgency, the kind that suggested something unscripted had just entered the evening. Conversations fell away instantly. The room turned, not toward Ryan, not toward the bride, toward the stage, and then, almost instinctively, back toward Emily and Daniel. The host cleared his throat, glancing briefly at a tablet in his hand before continuing, his voice now carrying a weight that had not been there earlier. We have just received confirmation regarding tonight's final announcement concerning the Blake Development Group partnership. The name landed like a spark in dry air. Ryan's head snapped toward the stage, his posture tightening immediately, instinctively, as the conversation shifted into territory he understood. Business, power, control. This was his ground. Or at least, it had always been. Emily felt Daniel's grip shift slightly, not tightening, but grounding, as if anchoring her for what was coming next. The host continued, each word more deliberate now, more precise. After final review, the controlling investment has been officially transferred to Whitaker Holdings. The silence that followed was immediate, absolute. It was not confusion. It was recognition arriving all at once. The kind that did not need explanation. Emily felt it ripple through the room, the sudden recalculation, the immediate shift in hierarchy, in power, in narrative. Ryan did not move. For a second, he simply stood there, as if the words had not fully reached him. Then they did. That is not possible, he said under his breath, the same phrase he had used before. But this time, it carried something entirely different. Not disbelief, but impact. Real, unavoidable impact. His eyes moved slowly, almost unwillingly, from the stage to Daniel. And in that moment, everything connected. Not just the presence, not just the name, the scale, the reach, the quiet, deliberate timing of it all. Daniel did not look at him immediately. He remained beside Emily, composed, unshaken, as if this outcome had never been in question. Because for him, it had not. The host continued, unaware, or perhaps fully aware of the tension unfolding in real time. Mr. Daniel Whitaker will now assume controlling authority over the project, effective immediately. A murmur surged through the crowd, louder now, undeniable, the kind of reaction that marked a true shift in power, not just socially, but structurally. This was not a moment. This was a takeover. Ryan took a step forward, then stopped, his mind racing through implications, contracts, leverage, every variable he had once controlled now slipping beyond his reach. He began, his voice tight, controlled, but strained, as he looked directly at Daniel for the first time without pretense. You planned this. It was not an accusation. It was a realization. Daniel met his gaze calmly, his expression unchanged, but there was something else there now. Not dominance, not arrogance, but inevitability. I completed it, he said simply. The distinction mattered, because it meant this had been in motion long before tonight, long before the wedding, long before Ryan ever realized he was part of a larger game he did not see. Emily felt it then, the final layer of the shift settling into place. This was not just about her, not just about reclaiming identity. This was about power, real power, the kind that did not need to announce itself, the kind that moved quietly, precisely, until the moment it chose to reveal itself. Ryan's world had not just been challenged. It had been restructured. Publicly. Completely. And everyone in that room was watching it happen. His bride stepped back again, this time fully, her presence no longer even attempting to hold relevance as the magnitude of the situation became undeniable. The wedding, the event, the carefully curated image of success, all of it had just been overshadowed by something far greater. Ryan looked at Emily then, not with control, not with expectation, but with something raw, something unguarded. Understanding. Too late. You knew, he said quietly. Not a question. A statement. Emily held his gaze, calm, steady, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression. Not distance, not closure, but clarity at its peak. No, she said softly. I chose not to be blind anymore. The correction was subtle, but absolute. Around them, the room had fully shifted now, no longer watching a personal confrontation, but witnessing the collapse of one narrative and the rise of another. And at the center of it all stood the woman who had once been invisible, now impossible to ignore. And as the weight of everything settled, one truth became undeniable to everyone present. This was not just her return. It was his fall, and it had only just begun. The word fall did not arrive with noise. It settled, heavy and undeniable, into every corner of the room, into every glance that now shifted away from Ryan Blake and toward the man who had just rewritten the outcome of his most important deal in a single, quiet announcement. Emily felt the weight of it not as shock, but as alignment, as if everything that had been building beneath the surface had finally risen into view. Daniel remained still beside her, composed, unaffected, but the room no longer saw him as just a presence. They saw what he controlled, what he could change, and more importantly, what he had just taken. Ryan stood motionless, his mind moving faster than his body, calculating, retracing, searching for the moment where control had slipped, where the structure he had built had been quietly dismantled without his awareness. When? He asked, the word barely audible, but carrying more weight than anything he had said before. It was not directed at Emily. Not entirely. It was directed at the reality unfolding in front of him. Daniel answered, calm, precise. Before you finalized your expansion bid. The sentence landed with surgical clarity, because it meant this had not been reaction. It had been timing, strategy, intent executed without error. Ryan's breath caught, just slightly, as the implications expanded beyond the room, beyond the wedding, into everything he thought he controlled. You waited, he said, his voice tightening, not with anger, but with the realization of being outplayed. Daniel's gaze did not waver. I observed. The correction was subtle, but devastating, because it meant Ryan had revealed everything himself. Every move, every weakness, every assumption. Emily watched him, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with something quieter. Understanding of a different kind. This was not destruction. It was exposure. The truth of how fragile his empire had always been when built on perception alone. Around them, the crowd had fully shifted now, no longer whispering, no longer uncertain. They were watching with clarity, with the kind of attention reserved for irreversible moments. Investors, partners, competitors, all recalculating, all adjusting. Ryan felt it. Of course he did. The room was no longer his. It had not been for several minutes now. He just had not accepted it yet. "You think this ends here?" he said suddenly, his voice regaining a fraction of its former strength, not because he believed it, but because he needed to say it. Deals can be challenged. Structures can be renegotiated. The words sounded familiar again. Like him. Like the version of himself that fought to maintain control. But even as he spoke them, they lacked something. Certainty. Daniel regarded him for a moment, not dismissively, but with a calm that bordered on final. "They can," he said. A pause. Then, with quiet precision, "but not this one." The finality in his tone did not need emphasis. It was already understood. Ryan's jaw tightened, the last visible sign of resistance, but it did not hold. Not against reality. Not against the shift that had already occurred. His bride stepped further back, no longer even attempting to remain part of the moment, her presence now completely disconnected from the narrative unfolding. The wedding, the celebration, the carefully curated image of success, all of it had dissolved into something secondary. Irrelevant. Emily felt the shift settle fully now, not just in the room, but within herself. The humiliation, the erasure, the years of being unseen. They no longer defined this moment. They had led to it, but they did not own it. She stepped forward slightly, not away, not toward, but into her own space, her own position within a reality that no longer required permission to exist. Ryan looked at her then, his expression stripped of everything that once made him untouchable. "Was this part of it?" he asked quietly. "All of this?" The question held more than business, more than the deal. It held everything. The night, the reveal, the timing. Emily met his gaze, steady, unshaken, and for a moment, there was no tension left between them. Only truth. "No," she said. "This was always coming." The distinction mattered, because it meant he had not been targeted. He had simply been unprepared. The words settled into him, deeper than anything else that had been said, because they removed the last illusion of control he could hold on to. Around them, the room had fully recalibrated, no longer watching a confrontation, but witnessing the conclusion of something far larger than any one relationship. This was not just personal. It was structural, final, and as the weight of that reality pressed in, one truth became impossible to ignore. Ryan Blake had not just lost a deal. He had lost position, power, and the narrative he had spent years building. And standing in front of him, calm, composed, no longer invisible, was the one person he had believed would never be part of that outcome. And now, there was only one thing left to determine. Not what he had lost, but what she would choose to do next with everything she had gained. The room had already chosen its new center. There was no returning from that. Emily could feel it in the silence that now followed every word, in the way no one interrupted, no one redirected, as if the entire evening had quietly surrendered to a truth that could no longer be ignored. Ryan Blake stood in front of her, no longer the architect of the moment, no longer the man who dictated outcomes, but someone forced to stand inside a reality he did not design. And for the first time, there was nothing left for him to say that could change it. Emily took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment. Not the victory, not the fall, the completion. This was not revenge. Not exactly. It was something cleaner, something quieter. It was the end of needing anything from him at all. Daniel's presence beside her remained unchanged, but now it felt different. Not like a shield, not like a statement, but like a future that existed independent of the past she had just closed. Around them, the crowd remained still, waiting, watching, as if instinctively understanding that whatever she did next would define not just the end of this moment, but the beginning of everything after it. Ryan's voice came again, but it no longer carried weight. "So that is it?" he asked, quieter now, stripped of everything that once made him untouchable. "You just walk away?" The question hung there, but it was no longer a challenge. It was a realization forming in real time. Emily looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more final. Peace. No, she said softly. A pause. Then, with quiet clarity, I already did. The words settled into the space between them like something irreversible. Because walking away was not what she was about to do. It was what she had done long before she stepped into this room. This moment was just the proof. Ryan's gaze dropped slightly, just for a second, as if absorbing something too heavy to hold directly. And in that small, almost imperceptible shift, everything that once defined him in her life disappeared completely. Not broken, not damaged, gone. Emily turned then, fully, without hesitation, her hand still in Daniel's, but her movement entirely her own. And this time, when she walked, the room did not just watch. It moved for her. Subtle, immediate, unquestioned. Conversations parted. Space opened. Attention followed. Not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. The invisible had become undeniable. The woman who had once stood at the edge of this same room, erased, dismissed, reduced to something small, now walked through it as the most powerful presence within it. Not because of who stood beside her, but because of who she had become. Behind her, Ryan did not call her name again. He did not step forward. He did not try to reclaim anything. Because there was nothing left to reclaim. Only the understanding that what he had lost was never something he truly possessed. The music resumed again, softer this time, but it no longer defined the atmosphere. The room had changed. Permanently. Emily felt it with every step, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as freedom. Real. Uncomplicated. Earned. And as she reached the exit, the lights shifting subtly as the doors opened ahead of her, she paused for just a fraction of a second. Not to look back, but to acknowledge something within herself. The woman she had been. The life she had left. The silence she had endured. All of it had led here. Not to prove anything, but to become everything she was always meant to be. She stepped forward. The night air met her, cool, open, uncontained. And for the first time in years, there was no past pulling at her, no voice defining her, no shadow she needed to step out of. Only forward. Only possibility. Only the quiet, undeniable truth that her story had never been about what she lost. It had always been about what she would build once she reclaimed it. And somewhere behind her, in a room that would remember this night long after it ended, one truth would remain. The woman they once overlooked had become the one no one would ever forget.